So first of all, I would like to say how deeply honoured I am to be invited to speak here and to thank Thomas and the President for their kind introductory remarks. I feel like I'm standing in an institute, a building, a university which encapsulates all that is best about the modern university and which I think everyone in this room will value greatly. And what I'm going to talk about today is where the universities of our world may be going. Because when you live and work in a university, it is a little bit like a fish swimming in a sea, and things change very gradually and in ways that you don't really notice. And what I try to do is to step back and to look at some of the trends, both favourable and unfavourable, and how these relate to what is happening in the world, and particularly to my own particular interest, which is the intersection between universities and the labour market. And I think the first thing to say about universities is that as institutions, they are extraordinarily long-lived. They're extraordinarily long-lived, but they also, at the moment, enjoy a position which is quite unprecedented in terms of their importance in society and the number of people who are influenced by them and who come into their rooms, their lecture theatres, their campuses. And to ask why have we reached what in many ways is a golden age for a university, though it's very hard to convince any academic, let alone any representative of a union in any of our universities, that it is a golden age, but I promise you in many ways it is. Why have we reached this position? Was it inevitable that we should become the institutions which in many ways define our societies? And can this continue? And just to illustrate this, I have put up some institutions with more or less longevity. And you will notice there is not a French university in the list, and everybody here will probably know why, and I will come back to that, because, but the only institution which really beats the universities for long life and endurance is the Catholic Church, with which our history is very strongly entangled. And you can take your pick for the Catholic Church, whether you say it was established in the year 30 or at the Edict of Milan 313, but it's right up there, whatever. But straight after that, you find the universities, and I've put up two of the oldest, Bologna and Oxford, but also Harvard, which is also, of course, far, far older than the country in which it resides. But then you start to get even to the East India Company, which was a rather bizarre company which managed to take over large parts of the subcontinent. And you come to modern institutions, modern companies. And I think the thing to emphasize about the modern corporation is that it tends to be very short-lived. It doesn't last very long. Standard Oil didn't even last a half century. Bethlehem Steel wound up in 2001. IBM, well, I would like to lay a bet that there are a large number of people in this room today who will still be alive when IBM folds. So universities are very unusual. But today they have also undergone a transformation. The size and nature of which is quite extraordinary, and which I think it's only when you stand back that you become aware of how dramatic and enormous this has been. Institutions that enroll tens of thousands are now the norm. A small university is one that enrolls 10 or 15,000. This growth has been meteoric and it's been recent. And it has also been very expensive because up to now, all around the world, the state is paying far higher proportions of vastly larger university budgets than have ever been the case in previous eras. And just to give you an example, I thought I would put up Somerville College, Oxford, the entire student body in 1885, which is slightly extreme, but not so extreme. I mean, if I'd put up the first institutions of higher education for women in France, it would look equally small. And contrast this with an examination hall in a current contemporary East Asian university. And not only are universities growing in size, but as you can tell from this hall, Strasbourg is not alone in having cranes continually on site. Around the world, universities are fueling a building boom. The thing that I want to emphasize is how recent and how rapid this change has been. And what I've put up here are university student numbers in 3 major European states. And I've chosen the obvious ones. I've chosen France on the left, Germany in the middle, and the UK on the right. And when you first look at this slide, you probably don't notice that there's a tiny little blue column in each of those groups. So there's a big orange one and a pretty big grey one, but there's also a tiny little blue one. And that tiny little blue column shows how many university students there were in each of these countries in 1900, which is not so long ago. The orange one is the number of students there are enrolled in each of these countries today, and the grey one is how many there would be allowing for population growth, because of course our populations have all grown. But as I said, I can tell you that basically, until you really fix your gaze on how tiny that little blue column is, how almost invisible, it's hard to take in just how dramatic and how recent this explosion in size has been. And the next thing I wanted to show you, which again at some level I think we are all beginning to get used to, but which would astonish my parents, never mind my grandparents, is current graduation rates. The average graduation rate, and these are people who have completed tertiary education, who are in the age 25 to 34 group. So the generation for whom mass higher education first became a general reality throughout the developed world. The OECD average is 44% of that age group has completed tertiary education. The EU 21, which is the pre-expansion 27, is 42. France is 44, bang on average, as you are often in many indicators within the OECD. Japan, 60. Switzerland, 50 for tertiary, it's less for universities proper. And the important thing is it can go further. It almost certainly will go further. It can go further at amazing speed. China is probably the most rapid, which enrolled less than 1% of its population in higher education in 1949, was up to 43% in 2016. Taiwan, 2/3 of the cohort goes into higher education. South Korea, it's 80%. And there is nothing in any of the statistics, anywhere in the world, to indicate that this is going to go into reverse, although governments vary, and I choose my words carefully, governments vary in how far they try to hold the increase back. Not in whether or not they believe that it will go further, but in how actively they try to hold the increase back. Now, it is also true that the higher education systems, the universities of the world vary considerably, both in how they recruit and in their internal structure, and in how much they spend. What I have put up there again are some obvious key comparator countries. The blue columns are the sort of the core annual expenditure that goes directly to core teaching and research functions. The total annual spend includes money coming into the sector from a variety of other sources, such as businesses. And one of the things that you can see there, and this is all in US dollars at purchasing power parity, and, as always, hooray for the OECD, which gives us these wonderful figures and makes these comparisons possible. What you can see is there is considerable variability. There's considerable variability from the United States on the right, which is spending the most on average per full-time university student of that group. It won't, I think, surprise anybody in this European audience that Italy is pretty low, and it certainly is something which causes any Italian academic constant grief. But the other thing which I think it's important to emphasize is that although there is a lot of variation here, the basic structure of these universities is very similar. Even more similar, since the Bologna Agreement meant that, at least in Europe, everybody moved to a notionally similar structure of degrees. But essentially, if you walk into a university pretty much anywhere in the world, if you know what universities are like, you walk into a university and it's clearly the same sort of a place. It may have very few facilities, it may feel like it is, we were masquerading as a country club, we were talking about this at lunchtime, but it's basically doing the same thing. And the prime thing it does, of course, is it sucks students in, it gives them a better or a worse education, and it spews them out the other end with a certificate round their necks. And that's what universities do. It's actually what universities have always done, to some extent. And these days they do research as well. But what I also want to emphasize, because I think this is important to thinking about where our sector is going, is that even if you're Italy, the cost of the university systems of today is enormous. It's very high for the taxpayer, and it's actually also very high for the students. This is a sector, I won't call it an industry for the moment, though it can sometimes feel like an industry if, like me, you're on the finance committee of your university. The cost is very high. We are spending a very large amount of money on these institutions, both through government channels, but also as individuals. So the OECD average expenditure on higher education is 1.5% of GDP, compared to 3.5% for all the rest of formal education put together. So this is a really major call on public funds. If you are a finance minister or a politician trying to look at where you can free up funds to spend on other priorities, or looking ahead at a fiscally strained future, this is a big spender. This is spending a large amount of money. And it's also, of course, placing a large financial burden on students themselves. Obviously, you come to university as a student to learn and also to further your career. In doing so, you don't work for several years, and you also, whether or not you have to pay for the tuition, you have to live, and maintenance costs also need to be factored in and are not covered at all by those figures that I've just put up. But they are major, and when, as I have just finished doing a major review of post-18 funding, part of a team doing a review of post-18 education funding for the United Kingdom. And one of the things that is brought home to me very forcibly is the extent to which in our modern system the maintenance costs and the costs of living in major cities are a part of the higher education equation today, which involves huge impact on the cities themselves, on housing and on families, and is one of the sources, I would say, of major inequalities in our higher education system. So there we are. We are huge. We are, as a sector, disposing of very large proportions of national wealth, though hopefully contributing a great deal to it as well. And we are so enormously much bigger than anybody could have conceived of in any century before the one that we have just come through. That the universities of the past were those tiny institutions with those little blue columns, and today the majority of young people in many countries expect, quite rightly, that they will go through a university education of some sort, and those who don't are very conscious that they're not going to do so, whereas in centuries to come, universities simply did not figure in the mental map of the vast majority of the population. So where next? Is the current position of the universities impregnable? Why have they become so huge and so rich? And will the forces that have brought us to this position endure? Well, I want to start by a little bit of potted history, because I started at the beginning by pointing out that universities had actually been around for a remarkable amount of time compared to almost anything else in our modern societies. But history does also remind us that this growth has not been smooth, and I would argue it has not been inevitable. So the origin of the modern university lay in the existence of the Catholic Church and its tensions with and independence from the nation state. So these were essentially European institutions. Our modern institutions were born of this unique tension between two quite different sources of power, wealth, and influence. The medieval foundations, which followed on from informal groupings of scholars, were accepted and indeed encouraged by the state often. But they also answered ultimately to the church and to the Pope, and when you set up a university, it was typically through a papal bull. And the unique, although fluctuating levels of autonomy that they enjoyed historically reflected the existence of these two rival and powerful sources, the secular state and the Catholic Church. And again, the Catholic Church encouraged endowments for these institutions, so they often became individually and independently wealthy. And these endowments were linked to church beliefs, linked to church practices. They further underpinned the independence of the medieval and late medieval universities. But again, as I'm sure you're all very aware of, as you all have studied at school and know from your own environments, the early modern period of Europe was one where the power of the church waned, the nation state exerted its power, and as it did so, the university's position also changed and often weakened. And the fact that I'm standing here in Strasbourg, of course, brings this home incredibly vividly, because Strasbourg has a quite particularly interesting history. But I think that what happened to the French universities generally is a good reminder that there is nothing inevitable about the structure and status and independence and autonomy of our institutions. Because France, after all, had a very early and successful start. I mean, the University of Paris came on the heels of Bologna. It was one of the great universities. And interestingly, for me growing up in England, I mean, the Sorbonne was this magic name to conjure with, and it was this great institution. And I didn't discover until I was a very great deal older that actually there was a period when when Paris did not have a university, because the French Revolution had abolished the universities. But what is interesting about why they abolished the universities, and I have to apologize at this point. I had an extremely interesting conversation with Alain Baretz this morning, and there's one thing I would have changed on this if I had known earlier. But I think that looking at the universities today, the period of the French Revolution, as it is with so many things, is still extraordinarily interesting and germane. Because what is interesting about it is that it was a period of, first, enormous libertarianism. I mean, the extreme libertarians of California would recognize the sentiments of the revolutionaries completely, followed by renewed and enhanced central control. And what happened in the revolution was that, first of all, the universities were abolished. But what is very interesting about them was at the same time as abolishing the universities, all licensing requirements were also, for a short period, abolished. And I think this is a very modern take on things, this idea that only being allowed to practice as a doctor or a lawyer is an affront to liberty, that these are just ways of enriching self-interested elite groups, is a set of ideas which certainly has not gone away. I mean, there's a great deal of, there are powerful currents of thought that still see this, and I will return to this in a moment. Because what was true about the medieval university was that it existed to educate people who moved into particular types of elite job, as priests, as lawyers, as doctors. When the revolution came here, it not only swept away the church, but it swept away the idea that you should have to be licensed to be a doctor or licensed to be a lawyer, because that was a way of perpetuating privilege and obstructing liberty. And I don't think they used the word competition, but if they'd been Californian, they certainly would. Now, the non-licensing of doctors did not last long, but for my purposes, I suppose the other point I would like to make, and again this will be very familiar to most of this audience, is that Napoleon then created a single central body, the University of France, which was called the l'Université de France. It wasn't actually it doesn't translate into university in English, but accurately, with authority over all education. And this, of course, was a complete reversal of what happened in the early medieval period when these bodies became uniquely autonomous. And although various acts during the 19th century, including the Falloux Act, which was partly about restoring the power of the Catholic Church, introduced major changes, the interesting thing is that autonomy for individual universities, I had thought, until I was taught better this morning, was restored significantly in 1893, but I now know better that actually a lot of it had to wait for 1968. So France is, to me, extremely interesting, because it encapsulates these stresses and strains in any set of institutions which, like universities, are very important in society and are therefore likely to be the subject of attack as well as support as politics changes. And just very quickly, I thought I would also tell you a little bit about the mid-17th century in England. 1642 was kind of the beginning of our Civil War period. And what is very interesting about that is that the proportion of members of Parliament in 1642 who had been effectively to university, we had our legal training was in the Inns of Court, which were kind of semi-university institutions. The proportion of people who the proportion of members of Parliament who were university educated in 1642 was almost 3/4. And it took till a few years ago to reach that level again. Today that would be true, but even when I was a child, when there were a large number of Labour members of Parliament who had been manual workers and so on, we were still well below that peak. And the percentage of young males in the population entering higher education in England, again, it took to the 1930s to reach that level once again. So universities had a pretty choppy period between the decline of the power of the Catholic Church and the importance of the priesthood and the fact that they were the places where the prelates trained and which controlled in most countries entry to medicine and law, and the present. And then you come to the present. Now, what is important, I think, to emphasize about the present is that really the churches are irrelevant to modern universities. It's not just outside Europe, where clearly have the Catholic Church, but that we are secular societies in which even if you live in a country which has an established church, as I do, they are not anymore a countervailing source of power. We live in societies where the state dominates unchallenged. It may allow us liberty or it may not, but it has no real rival pole in the way that the medieval state did. Now, universities are highly privileged within these states. They dominate professional training. So the French Revolution's attempt to destroy licensing did not last for very long. And of course, they also have a new role, which is absolutely central, that of scientific research. Both depend on and exist through state funding and through state activity. And even in countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, where people pay fees up front, state revenues for higher education, for the research and for the tuition, far outstrip private spending. This was not true in previous periods. This is new. The universities of the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries did not ever depend on the state in the way that we all do today. So why did the universities thrive and why did they decline? Well, the first set of drivers of growth and decline are very much to do with the job market of a particular sort, and especially the public sector job market. And under the public sector job market, in this case, I am including the Catholic Church. So essentially, the universities were important to the extent that the church and the state were hiring. And that was essentially what drove them, although they were also, of course, the people in them were truly driven by the things that we value so much, by independent inquiry, by thought, by philosophy. But They thrived to the extent that the important institutions of the society wanted them and wanted their graduates, and declined to the degree that this ceased to be the case. And so, the obvious and conventional explanation of why universities today are so big is the modern labour market. And it is true that our modern labour market and our modern society, which, again, I would emphasise is created and driven, especially in our modern era, by things that universities are engaged in terms of research and thought. But if you look at the modern labour market in 1900 or 2000, it is indeed transformed. In 1900, 5% of the workforce were in professional and technical occupations. In the year 2000, it's up to 25% if you're being generous. Semi-skilled and operative agricultural employment, big in 1900, much smaller in 2000, almost nobody works in agriculture. 1900, few married women. Year 2000, employment rate for adult women almost as high as for men, and everywhere in the world, the majority of university students are female. So does this explain where we are, and does it mean that in a way the size and the importance of universities doesn't really need any explanation, you just need to look at the job market? Well, only up to a point, because the other very clear characteristic of the modern labour market, again in more and more and more countries, is the very high proportion of graduates who hold non-graduate jobs, who hold jobs which have not themselves changed since they were held overwhelmingly by people who had not gone to university. And the other thing that I want to show you is a graph, which is quite interesting, because whereas the labour market changed rather gradually, what this shows, and it would show it even just equally dramatically if I showed it for Thailand, China, Egypt, wherever, is that what happens with university enrollment, slightly less with the United States because it did it sooner, but it's the same thing, is that it chugs along for a while, getting a bit bigger, and then it takes off. You get this point at which suddenly it takes off, a bit like people adopting a new type of product, a bit like the graphs for, everybody suddenly has a phone, everybody suddenly has an iPad. So why? What is it that drives this very distinctive enrollment pattern that you find again and again and again in the last century? And what drives it is, to a small extent, and not irrelevantly, changing labour market demands, but it is far more of a political and citizens process. So on the left-hand side, you've got what it feels like to be a politician who is actually paying the bill most of the time. And politicians' responsiveness to electoral demands became a responsiveness to a population that wanted more and more higher education. This was then strengthened and reinforced and indeed spiraled upwards because of a set of beliefs about what encourages growth. And the near universal growth belief of modern politicians that university education drives economic growth. The third thing that drove it is a commitment to equality in a democratic state, this belief that a government must try to make access open to all, and that expanding higher education is a way of doing this. And the fourth is changing labour market demands and the fact that, yes, we need more engineers, we need more doctors, we need everything else. On the right-hand side, I have put the things that drove this ongoing demand and appetite for more higher education from the citizenship. People were richer. They could afford to be university students. They could afford to support their children through it. A set of qualification signalling spirals, which I'm going to come back to as one of my main points, in a moment, which creates strong pressure, changing opportunities also, and the three things together, as I said, fueling a demand among people for more university places for their children to be allowed to go. Now, I'm going to come back to the effects of the spiral in a moment, but I first of all want to talk a little bit about the belief in education for growth, because this is extraordinarily important in explaining why our governments are so consistently willing to spend large amounts of money on higher education. And governments around the world have become convinced that increasing expenditure on education and increasing the number of people going through higher levels fuels economic growth. And in fact, both increased levels of university participation and research spending are seen as silver bullets for the economy. And I'm not going to talk very much about whether or not they're right about research, but I am going to talk a little bit more about the idea that just having more and more people in universities will actually be good for the economy. And the funny thing is that up to now, as growth has started to falter, the faith in education spending has not really been shaken. On the contrary, as governments get more and more desperate for something that they can do, they pin more and more of their hopes to changing, reforming, expanding education. Now, the argument is, in a sense, it's a very simple one. You invest in education, education creates skills, skills attract economic investment and make use of economic investment, you get more economic development, you can afford more, you invest more in education, and round the virtuous circle you go. And it's a plausible argument. The belief that this would be the case, that it was all actually that uncomplicated, was underpinned by the traditional role of developing skills, but also the perceived importance of research. So what you got was this belief that the universities were unbelievably well placed to create economic growth by generating skills, which would then go out into the marketplace and jobs would follow, and by the fact that they were also contributing to research. Now, the modern research university, and we're standing in a very obvious example of it, is very new. It's the bit of the university that is very new, and it's the bit of the university which I think actually is probably, in the short term, the most secure. But I just want to say a little bit about it. It's clear in Strasbourg, this is something of which you're very, very aware, because the modern research university developed in 18th century Germany with professors and laboratories, apprentice research students, and enormous freedom to select their field of inquiry. And it was actually originally, I would argue, the product of small competing German states outdoing each other, which was then adopted and loved by Prussia, which then, of course, became German emperor. It was exported to the US and later elsewhere. The French model was a different one originally. It was a single national teaching corporation with research facilities. But the German model and the idea of the research university has effectively taken over in the world. Universities are regarded as central to research and development activity. They're huge research establishments, and they provide the people who people the scientific profession. So this is for the United States, and it just shows you both the number of people who are scientists and the number of scientists per million population. And you can see how in the first half of the 20th century this just exploded, and again how enormously many researchers per million inhabitants we have today in any high-income part of the world. There are many, many, many researchers. And so the idea that universities produce skills which generate growth and that universities produce research which generates growth, I mean, this is our received wisdom, and this is why universities are, in fact, enjoying so much support from the government. And many people here, like me, will remember the Lisbon Strategy, which was intended to make Europe the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. And what is interesting about it, if you study this like me, is when you go back and you read it, it sort of encapsulates absolutely this set of beliefs, that if you focus on spending more on research and focus on raising education attainment defined by the number of average years in education, this in itself will transform the economy. That you can fire these two bullets and you will be the most competitive and the most dynamic economy there is. And the EU states have signed up to a substantial annual increase in per capita investment and to ensuring that the number of 18 to 24-year-olds who are not in further education and training should be halved by 2010. Now, I'm not standing here and saying that what we do in universities is a waste of time. But I do want to underline that we have enjoyed the fruits of a period when, as I said, there was a belief that by increasing spending on research and increasing the number of people in universities, you could guarantee that growth would follow, that this in itself would create competitiveness and dynamism. And now I think it's getting to the point where one has to ask, is this faith in education and universities justified? Has it actually delivered on these enormous promises? And if it hasn't, what does this mean for the future of state support and for the future of our sector? Now, much of the belief in the power of higher education to transform the economy was based on the fact that graduates earn more than non-graduates. The average, you take the graduates in a population, you take the non-graduates in a population, you find that one lot earn more on average than the others. And it's always been a slight question how far that was because of what we as universities did and how far it was because the people who went to university were perhaps cleverer and more advantaged and more privileged and better networked to begin with. But the reality of the last 15 to 20 years is that we are finding everywhere that the average income gain that individuals get from a degree is going down, which you might indeed think is possibly inevitable when you start sending more and more people, because these, after all relative amounts. But also, as I said, that large and increasing proportions of the recent graduates work in non-graduate jobs. And depending on how you define it, it tends typically to come out at least a third, sometimes as much as 45%. And just to give you some sense of how much this fall has been, in the UK we are particularly addicted to this, by the way, and we have particularly good data joining up people's education and school-level education and their earnings and so on. And, I don't know whether in France you have done anything quite this detailed, but we are completely addicted to it. And what it shows is that the lifetime pay premium has fallen really quite dramatically. That in 2004, the average pay premium from obtaining a degree was 41% compared to the average for pay as a whole. It's only across the wasn't that enormous even then. By 2017, just 13 years later, our Office for National Statistics calculated it was down to 24%. So that was the amount extra that you would earn compared to the national average from having gone to university. In the US, where college participation rates continue to rise, what has happened is that for males between the 50th and 80th percentiles of the earnings distribution, there's actually been no growth in real income at all. It's just flatlined. Women have done better. But men, between the 50th and 80th percentiles, their real incomes have stagnated, even though the large majority of those people will have gone to college. It still makes sense to go to college because the wages of people who dropped out of high school or only went to high school has gone down, so it still makes financial sense. But you have to start asking, so where are these economic returns? Is this really such a silver bullet? And again, and you may get some of this from Martin, this has coincided with a period when productivity in the developed world has really not been behaving very encouragingly. So here we have les Trente Glorieuses in the euro area, this enormous growth of the economy after the Second World War, then going down. The UK never went as high, bumped along, catapulted in 2008, and America also basically downwards. And if I give you the next one, which is again the sort of the key core countries that we in the UK and in France tend to look at, France, Germany, Italy, UK, US, what you have to say is that given that this graph coincides pretty much with this one, it's not looking terribly good. We may be expanding our brains, but in terms of delivering on what politicians had convinced themselves would happen, those two graphs beside each other are a bit discouraging. So, alongside this, there has also been the belief that at the very least expanding higher education would equalize life chances, make it be more progressive. And here again, I have to say that the statistics are not terribly encouraging. There has been a huge increase in access to higher education across the world. It has not been a period with a corresponding decline in income inequality. There is virtually no correlation between the degree to which a country has achieved equal access in terms of everybody going through upper secondary higher education and its level of income inequality. And there is no relationship that anybody has ever been able to find at a global level between progress in reducing educational inequality and access to higher education, and any reduction in income inequality. So at this point you ask, well, are people going to walk away? Are people going to decide, are your children and grandchildren going to decide that the game isn't worth the candle? University is just not worth it. I think this is extraordinarily unlikely. And there are a number of reasons for this, including the one that I referred to earlier, which was the qualification spiral and the natures of the labour market. And I referred earlier to licensing and the fact that the French Revolution tried to do away with it, and that the medieval university existed not just because people loved knowledge, but because you needed to be licensed to be a priest or a lawyer. And licensing is extremely important in the labour market because only the licensed can pursue a licensed profession. And this may secure higher standards and protection for the public, and I personally am very strongly in favour of medical licensing. I do know a couple of people who don't think you even need that. But of course, licensing creates barriers to entry, which is why the revolutionaries hated it, and it generally raises prices. And in the modern labour market, the move to objective criteria, the desire for regulation, accountability, has increased the importance of licensing enormously. And we in universities therefore have far more professions for which we are the licensing authorities. Universities also create rent in the sense of extra income for people that, strictly speaking, you don't need in order to get them into the labour market, because actually our modern values tie in very strongly with them. Our societies are very distinctive and new in the way we legitimise decisions and justify privilege. We are strongly against the idea that you should get a job because of how you know, who you knew. We are appalled mostly, or except perhaps where our own children are concerned, by the idea that privileged children should actually have a privileged future. But in aiming to be meritocracies, we try to tie individual rewards to objective criteria of individual performance, and of these, the most convenient, the most widespread, are measures of educational performance. And this systematically favours holders of formal certificates, and is one reason why so many jobs have become de facto graduate only. And added to this, we are large urbanised societies. So if you're an employer or a gatekeeper, you're not in a small village or a small town where you know people, you're faced with huge numbers of credentialed applicants. And if you talk to any of the big banks, the big consultancies, the government, you are flooded with applicants. And you are therefore forced to use rules for ranking and selecting among those who are formally equivalent. And therefore, you use educational qualifications. And one of the results of this across the world is that these people, these employers, increasingly perceive universities as increasingly unequal, and they rank not just by whether you have more educational qualifications, but by where you got them from. And so one of the things that has happened and is happening is that the combination of scale with the use of university education as the main legitimate route into the elite has given prestigious universities enormous market power. And I'd just like to show you this, and I'm nearly at the end, in visual form. So in 1950, if you were an employer, you probably assumed that by and large ability was normally distributed more or less. And you figured that on the whole, the people who went to university were mostly high ability. There might be a few who went and weren't, but they were mostly high ability. It was a rough correlation, but actually mostly didn't matter to you because most people weren't graduates and hardly any employers were recruiting in that graduate pool. So they recruited from the rest of the population and they tried to figure out who was good there. By 2000, which is, we've had a big growth in the last 20 years, you're getting to the point where it's actually beginning to be a big graduate pool. So you're starting to figure, well, it's not just enough to be a graduate. I want to find out where you're a graduate from. And I accept, I accept recruits onto a master's program. One of the things that our admissions office tells me every time they send an application through is whether or not this is a high quality, high prestige university or not. And they do that for the globe. I can overrule them. I don't have to just take people from the high prestige ones, but this is now completely organised. There's an organisation that does it for us. Now, what happens when you get here? We're not so far away from that in South Korea. What do? Well, two things happen. The first is that employers and gatekeepers rank universities. But the second thing is that from the point of view of an individual, it is very hard for people to reject higher education. Even though people are aware that most universities no longer deliver the rewards that any university once did, who is going to be the person who is brave enough to say, I'm going to go into the labour market and let people assume I'm in that white bit of the distribution? You have to be very, very secure. Now, countries vary. Some countries have well-established apprenticeship routes that continue this way. But what you find talking to any government is that all the pressure, even if you're Swiss, is to increase higher education enrollments because it's the easiest route. It's the route of least resistance. It promises people what they want. So are we too big to fail? Well, at one level, I think we are too big to fail. No government is going to close down institutions which provide a legitimate way of allocating life chances. We are too big to fail in one sense, because who is going to turn around to their citizens and say, your kids aren't going to get a ticket in the lottery. Only X% are going to be able to get in there. But I say governments may lose faith, and in my experience in both the United States and the United Kingdom, it is becoming very obvious that significant parts of the political establishment are losing faith in more degrees. And the risk may be that they start to lose faith in more research as well. At the moment, they're losing faith in more degrees. They are even more committed to the wonders of more research than they were before. And I think research is... I definitely think that research is the basis of our existence, but I do worry a little bit that having lost faith in the idea that they will get growth through more and more degree holders, that the current attempt to meet 3% of GDP may also lead to some misallocated funds and a backlash. Hopefully not. Hopefully it would be totally wonderful. But I do think that while we're too big to fail, we are not too big to be brought low by our own size. It seems to me likely and indeed inevitable that university hierarchies will become more marked, not less. I think also that it is almost inevitable that the quality of education which most students receive will tend to decline rather than improve. I'm sorry to be so gloomy about this, but governments are going to be under huge fiscal strain in the next few decades, and for them to maintain what our government mangles with the term unit of resource is going to be very hard. And I also think that in this context, where so much of the population goes through higher education, when so much is still pinned on it, when it is becoming the route into so much of the labour market, that the increased government oversight and regulation, which we all complain about, and which I think is deeply anti-productive, is likely to get worse. And I think that one of the things that universities need to do in the next 10 to 20 years is to be aware that while on the one hand governments have bought the idea that autonomy is important to university attainment, all the other forces in how governments operate are towards more accountability, more oversight and more regulation, and that we are going to face some very bumpy decades. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm sure there are questions. I have questions, but I'll let some of the audience start. Vous pouvez poser les questions en français aussi. Hein? Elle parle français. Yeah. Qu'est-ce que vous commencez?
Yeah, the whole point of the talk seems to me, in some sense, that the nature of what we thought of as a university has completely changed. When you went there before, you thought, well, this is a place to open your mind, get a better education, and then you get on to do whatever job you were going to do, with the exception possibly of priests and lawyers. But then that changed. Then it became the idea that you were somehow being trained for a particular purpose in life. And ever since then, it's become a sort of rat race where people in China are sacrificing everything they have as parents to get their child into the rat race. After all, there aren't that many jobs at the top. and they want to get their children into those jobs, and they're prepared to pay an enormous amount of their income. So the whole story seems to me to have completely changed. We're now in a rat race where all the parents see themselves as fighting to pay for their kids to get into this and to get to the top, and the top will always be small.
The top will always be small.
I think that's what keeps it going, this system. But at some point you say to yourself, well, aren't people going to give up sacrificing all of this just to get their kids a little bit higher?
I'm not sure that there was ever a golden age when people went to university just to open their minds. I think universities have always been deeply vocational from the point of view of many of the students, not all the students. But what I do think was true was that there was a space created within them where actually the universities themselves could operate what we think of as a true educational mission. I think that it was always true that many people went to university for much narrower reasons than we would like to think. And if they nonetheless expanded their minds when they were there, that was wonderful, but it was never the sole motive. But I do think that you are absolutely right, that one of the results of this scale is that it's extremely difficult to do that, and people don't even expect it as something they will get as well as an occupational lift. And what you say about China is absolutely right, and I think it just makes more overt and clear what is going on in many people's decision-making. If I talk to our Chinese students, they are extremely clear that you basically work through universities in terms of prestige, and you sort of almost don't, in many, this is not true for all of them, of course it isn't, but for many of them, it doesn't matter what you read, you get into whatever degree course you can in the highest prestige institution you can get to. And that is, of course, an entirely rational decision in this sort of environment. What I think worries me very much is that in the course of this, if the downward pressure on the universities in terms of the funding, and also to some extent the pressure on academics in terms of how they succeed, which is ways which are visible to the outside world and help to push their institution up, make it increasingly difficult to do good education, because actually really good education is very expensive. Politicians are always hoping that somehow the next technological breakthrough will mean that you can give a really effective education to people with hardly any human beings around. But you can't. I mean, you just can't. Actually, good education involves a lot of very expensive one-to-one, small group interlocution. And actually, again, I mean, if you look at the very early days of the German research universities and the early seminars, these were tiny groups, whereas now things get called a seminar, which our great-grandparents would have called a lecture. Yeah. And I think it's a real risk that we will actually lose that.
I mean, can I add something to this? You talk about China, but the US is very much the same way.
The US is very much the same way. It's just
my
Chinese students are so wonderfully open about it. They go, well, we didn't get into Oxford, so we thought we'd come to King's, kind of thing. Yeah, and why are you on this degree? Well, that was the one we could get onto.
Yeah.
So you talked about higher public education. What can you tell us about private higher education? Do you think that its importance may increase in the future?
Well, private education is actually quite complicated, because one of the things that's sort of quite interesting in the world is in some countries, the private universities are the highly selective ones, and the public ones are the ones that sort of mop up the demand. And in other countries, it's the exact opposite, which makes it very difficult to make any generalizations about public versus private. I mean, there are some countries where the public universities are the high prestige and selective ones, and then the private ones are allowed to set up very easily and charge lower fees, and everybody comes. So I think the general answer is that governments have all felt a need to allow expansion somewhere in the system in order to to ensure that this wave of demand from parents and young people who feel that they have to go to university and that this might really pay off, and that not going means that doors slam in your face, that they've usually gone for one or the other. And I mean, it is quite interesting because, South America, in fact, it seems to be almost random. One country, it's the private universities that are selected, and next door you cross the border and it's the public universities that are selected. I think what is true is that in many countries we do now have a dual system. In France, the European countries are quite unusual in basically mostly having maintained a single public or quasi-public envelope. I think we also tend often in Europe to have a sort of romanticized idea of private universities because we think of private universities as being Harvard and Stanford.
Trump University.
Also Trump. Also there, so they have both.
Jean-Marie, and then just a second, next.
First, I have a question with one of your numbers. The cost of universities that was 1.5% GDP compared to 3.5% for all others. Did you figure in research in that case or not?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I don't think I did. I'd have to double check. This was OECD figures, and I think it was whatever the university. It was. I'm afraid this is a terrible cop-out answer, and I will have to go and look. It was the OECD indicators, and it was what they classified as higher education rather than research. And I think they normally separate out research and higher education.
Yeah.
No, but that's an important
yes.
Then another thing is that you related universities' success, let's say, to growth. But there's another driver which is very important, which is health. And people will always be very careful about figuring in health. And progress in life expectancy and so on is very much related to research, therefore to knowledge, and therefore to universities. Yeah. Another thing which I'm quite surprised about, which is that it is also sometimes related to knowledge, and states are ready to spend for the Higgs boson, for gravitational waves, for black holes. This always surprises me, but it works. And I must say the physicists have been very clever and very convincing in that respect. Yes. Although, I am a chemist. Without chemistry, you would not stand here the way you are. Huh? You would not sit like this here. But for some reason, this attraction for knowledge, for knowing what we are doing around here, is a driver also. Maybe not knowledge. So clear. Yeah. I think health is a much stronger one because normal people.
I totally agree. Health is, one of the things which is always interesting is, we were talking about this earlier, people are very strongly interested in their own health because we're all terrified of dying. So, if you want a really effective lobby, go for health, So I certainly don't believe that funding for research is about to die out. And I do also believe that of course there is a thirst for knowledge, and if there were no thirst for knowledge, we would not be standing in this after all, this building which would have seemed impossible 250 years ago. Everything about this building would have seemed impossible. So I don't want to overdo this, but I think, which is why I gave this title to Are We Too Big to Fail or Are We Too Big to Succeed? I do think that the scale has some real risks. There's no question in my mind that we have ended up with this mass education system, which to me unquestionably means that the overwhelming majority of university students in this world do not begin to get the quality of education which was standard for university students not so long ago. And I think that this is actually a real threat to the quality of our future society, because these are, after all, the people who will be the future researchers, who will be the future seekers after knowledge. And there's a real price to pay. As I said, I am slightly alarmed on the research side by the enthusiasm with which governments, having sort of slightly cooled on the miracles to follow from mass higher education, have suddenly decided that miracles will follow from having a research spending target for GDP. I don't like targets. But you're of course right. Our societies would have to blow up totally before we abandoned research, and at the very least, if we dress everything up as health research, we will still be able to get the grants.
Yeah. Okay. The one last question, because it's a minute. Yeah. There will be some discussion afterwards.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm a mathematician, and I usually speak about Bologna Agreement in pejorative words. To me, it is a shame what happened afterwards, and I know a lot of my colleagues would agree. Yet you spoke about it in somewhat flattering terminology. I'm aware of many places that suffered. They had a good education. I was born in ex-Yugoslavia, went to school in Croatia when it was a good math school. And even the teachers, future teacher, math teachers, high school teachers had practically the same education as I did as an engineer, math engineer. And it was a hard school, and they learned math. Today, especially after Bologna, the part that is going to teach children mathematics is completely gone. In fact, they educate people not only in Zagreb, in Belgrade as well. Let's not talk about Sarajevo and so on. I think a lot of that will happen in many other countries in the world. It's just that Balkans suffered through the war and so on. But you know, people that are going to teach children math, they cannot draw a line through two points. And therefore, in the diploma exam, the last exam of the 4 years, they don't ask them that question because they would fail. This is the modern university in Zagreb. Thank you very much.
Can I just say about the Bologna process? I don't think I meant to speak about it particularly positively or negatively, to be honest. But perhaps I should say a little bit about it. The point I was trying to make was that even before there was this increase in uniformity in the formal structures of European universities, I think that a university was recognizably a university anywhere in the developed world. That what Bologna tried to do, after all, was, in theory, to make the structures more similar in pursuit of making it easier for people to move between countries and to have their qualifications recognized. And I have to say, I come from a country where, although we signed up to Bologna, it didn't really have any obvious impacts, and I think places varied. I don't know about your particular case, but there was certainly nothing in Bologna which required governments to reduce the content requirements of degrees. What I do think is the case is that the fact that a number of countries use the Bologna process as a way of making major changes in the structure of their universities also meant that it was easy to make short-term popular, long-term destructive changes in funding and demand. So I think this was not inherent in Bologna, but from what you're describing, and I can think of another couple of countries that I won't start going into details, it was used as an excuse to do things which would cost, where there would be no major cost. Short-term people would feel that they were benefiting, and the long-term result was really bad. Does that make sense? So I don't think it was inherent in Bologna. I think Bologna had very good intentions, which were only very partially realized.
Thank you very much. Let's thank Alison again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.